Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, only light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. Oh, Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, in giving of ourselves that we receive, and in dying that we're born to eternal life. Oh, Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you. Make Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, only light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. Oh, Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, in giving of ourselves that we receive, and in dying that we're born to eternal.
Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me so love. Where there is injury, let me so pardon. Where there is doubt, let there be faith. Where there's despair, let me sow hope. Where there is darkness, let there be light. Where there is sadness, joy. Oh, divine Master, grant that I may never seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born to eternal life, to eternal
CHATS at Bonum. Previously on FRIARSIDE CHATS, we learned about Christology, Jesus' identity. What was most interesting is how St. Francis saw Christ, not as a king or master, but rather by the vulnerability of the baby Jesus. He had a deep desire to experience the pain of Christ, and he did when he lived with the lepers. We're probably not expected to do this today, but instead we are called to carry the cross some other way, by not being judgmental, by listening to others, and by focusing less on the differences, but more on the similarities, as we are called to be children of God. We are called to live the gospel by doing charitable work, using charitable language, treating others with respect, and being kind to others, to be inclusive and mature in our relationships. In last week's episode, we concluded with a reflection question. How does Christ reveal himself to you in your daily life? Let us listen to the sharing of David Pandilio for this reflection question.
Christ reveals himself to me in my daily life when I wake up in the morning and begin the day with prayer, and I continue through a mindful exercise of gratitude. I get to recognize him through the little things, especially the Franciscan way of appreciating creation. It can be as simple as a ray of sunlight that touches my face and I feel its warmth as I walk on my way to work. I see him in the rain, in the wind, in my breathing, a reminder that I'm still alive and appreciate the gift of life. In my work as a nurse, Christ reveals himself to me in the expression of relief and appreciation of my patients. When I give them comfort and listen to them, I can also see Jesus in their sufferings and sorrows, and all those given to my care that compose the different stages of life. Jesus reveals himself even in the evenings of life, making me appreciate every moment I have while I'm still alive and breathing. Even before he passed away, Saint Francis of Assisi would even call death Sister Death. My experience in ministering, the dying, and praying at their bedside are one of the most powerful revelations Jesus imparts to me. He always makes me bring reality into focus and purifies me of my perceptions and illusions of what the world is, and by that way, putting me back into his will and plan for my life. Life is partaking in the Paschal mystery, in embracing the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus in the events of my life. Life is a gift to be cherished and revered. It is our thank you to God. Life is the language where we give our thanks to God. I now end with a quote from the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart. It goes, "If the only prayer you ever say in your life is thank you, that would suffice." End quote. I begin and end the day with the lens of gratitude. That is how I see Jesus in my daily life. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for sharing with us your reflection. Today, we will get to know more about another Franciscan charism, prayer and devotion. Today's episode is entitled Power of Prayer, and our guest for today is Father Robert Manansala, OFM. Let me turn you over to our two moderators, Len Hizon and Dennis Montecillo, co-heads of the Education and Formation Ministry here at SSAP.
Greetings. Welcome back to FRIARSIDE CHATS. We are blessed to have as our guest Father Robert Manansala, OFM. Welcome, Father Robert.
Thank you very much.
Father Robert Manansala made his solemn profession as a Franciscan in 1989 and was ordained as a priest in 1991. His first assignment was as a pastor at St. Anthony Parish in Santa Ana, Cagayan. Following that, he was a pastor at Santuario de San Pedro Bautista Church in Quezon City. In 2001, he flew to the Netherlands for studies and then moved to Champaign-Urbana. He was an assistant chaplain there, but he also continued his studies at the Catholic Theological Union at the University of Illinois. While there, he was also a spiritual director. In 2010, he was sent to Sri Lanka as a missionary and was there for 1 year. Following that year, he returned to the Philippines and became president of Our Lady of the Angels Seminary in Novaliches. While there, he was concurrently also a professor at the Maryhill School of Theology, Institute for Consecrated Life in Asia, Intercongregational Theological Center, also in Novaliches. Currently, he's a member of the pastoral team of Santuario de San Antonio, a provincial delegate to the Poor Clares in Luzon, and in 2016, the Holy Father appointed him a missionary of Mary. Right now, he serves concurrently as a retreat facilitator and a spiritual director. Welcome, Father Robert.
Thank you very much.
Father Robert, we're very interested in learning about your early childhood, and in particular, what events, if any, unfolded that started to point you in the direction of where you are today.
My relatives now tell me that even before my school days, I was telling everyone already that I will become a priest someday. And I must have gotten it from my paternal grandmother, who was very religious and very holy. And she really prayed for a priest in the family. So I cannot forget the times when she would gather us, especially in the evening, to pray together, the entire family in one big room. So those times already impacted me very much. And then I started to be involved in our parish as a altar server. And the example of our assistant parish priest was really outstanding. And so that was also, I think, a factor. And then I got involved in the parish as Legionary of Mercy. And then eventually, I decided to enter the minor seminary in San Fernando, Pampanga. But there was an incident. I was already in high school at the Assumption College then, which is now university. And our teacher, who was a sister, Dominican sister, she was talking about vocations, priesthood, religious life. And I was just listening, a young boy listening, and I felt my heart burning. And so immediately after the class, I told her, "Sister, I would like to become a priest."
Wow.
And she was very supportive because the following year, the seminary is just beside the university. The following year, I was in the seminary.
Wow.
How old were you at that time, Father?
I was like 13 years old.
That's a great
13 years
story.
old. So I really started as a diocesan seminarian. And becoming a Franciscan was a later development.
Can you tell us how the Franciscan way of life, what drew you to the Franciscan way of life?
I think it was the Lord Himself through Saint Francis. Not personally, of course, but it was through a book. It was through a book. I was sick for 3 days. I cannot forget that incident. And I asked one of my classmates, I cannot remember now even the name of that classmate, but I think God used him as an instrument,
Of course.
to get me a book on a saint. At the time, I had read a lot of books on saints already. And then this classmate of mine got me a book on Saint Francis. And for 3 days, I dived into the book. I ate the book. I ate the book. And I was alone in the dormitory of the seminary because I was sick. And I found myself crying and crying. I was so moved by the example of Saint Francis. His holiness, his love for Christ, his love for his fellow human beings, and even creation, his love for the poor. And then I just felt in my heart, this is what I want. This is what I seek, and this is what I long to do. And later on, I found out when I started reading about Saint Francis actually said those words.
Really?
Yes, when he discovered that God wanted him to live the gospel radically. And so I felt already in my heart. So that was a turning point, really. A turning point. Of course, I still had to discern.
Right.
I still had to discern.
Right.
I was then third year high school seminarian minor seminary. Another turning point, so I was seeking God and I was seeking His will. And when we are seeking God and when we are seeking His will, He will reveal Himself to us. He will reveal His will to us. I was then in charge of our library. And usually, I would clean the library after our sports. So I went to the library, I was sweating, and there was this big dictionary on a stand, and I just randomly opened it. And there on, I think, the right page, I saw the word Franciscan.
Wow.
And when I saw the word Franciscan, I melted, literally. Nobody there in the library. And so I just found myself again crying, really, on the floor. And I felt God was confirming to me the direction of my life. I was young. I did not really know how to discern. There was even one point I got a petal of flowers. I was removing a flower. I was removing the petals.
Yeah.
Whether I would be a Franciscan, or
Franciscan, diocesan, Franciscan, diocesan.
something like that. No, because I did not know how to discern methodically.
Yeah.
But that was really the turning point, and God was confirming to me the direction. And because of that experience, I just felt no one and nothing could prevent me from pursuing what I thought was God's will for me. Because my father did not like me actually to become a Franciscan. He did not also like me to become a priest. He wanted me to become a doctor. Yeah?
Really?
Yeah. But at that time, one of the books I was reading was the life of Saint Gabriel of the Sorrowful Virgin. And the motto of Saint Gabriel, a young saint, the time is now. When God calls you, that is the time to respond. And so I was so convinced of that. The time is now for me to follow God's will. And so no one and nothing could prevent me. I was ready to be disowned by
Your family?
my family, particularly by my father. But that was the experience of St. Francis, no?
Same, exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
Yeah,
You
you're-
sold all the things.
So here's the question, then, Father Robert. Was your discussion with your father as dramatic as the story of St. Francis?
No,
Was this a Hollywood type of conversation, or did this?
I
Was it
did
just
not have to
annoyance?
remove my clothes. No?
In the public
In the
square.
public, before a bishop. No, I remember because my father went abroad also to work abroad. But before he left, he put me in a corner and he told me, at the time he said, okay, I'm already agreeing that you will become a diocesan priest, but not a Franciscan.
Wow. He made the distinction.
Yeah, because if I would be a Franciscan, I would be away from my family.
I
I
see.
could be assigned abroad in
That's
different
right.
places.
Yes,
And I would be away from our home place, from my family. I was just listening to him, but at the back of my mind I said, God first.
Yeah.
God first. And that's why I went to the seminary in Olas without their knowledge. I took the exam. And my father was already abroad then, so I just told them, I have passed the exam, I am entering.
It sounds like there was a confluence of events, like
Yeah.
and mystical experiences, where God really spoke to you. And I
Yeah.
like what you were saying about your heart was burning.
Yes, because that's one of the indications. Of
Yeah.
course, you have to discern it. And you know, some of these are external signs.
Yes.
They don't mean anything to some people.
That's right.
But I think if God is already doing something in your heart, and when you see even an external sign or confirmation, you just get it. He is just confirming what He's already doing in your heart.
Yes.
So during the time of my prayer and discernment, He was already working in my heart. And then I saw the sign even external. So God was very generous in even giving me external signs. I think.
Yeah.
And those are unforgettable moments
Of course.
because especially as I went through when there were discouragements and even now when there are difficulties, I would always go back to these times when I felt without doubts
Right.
of God's call for me.
It's amazing, Father, because even it's like paralleling the life of Saint Francis.
No, I'm very far from St. Francis.
Oh, but I mean, the obstacles and the challenges that he had to encounter, because everything that he lived through, there was always an obstacle. There was always something that blocked his way.
Yeah, but St. Francis is very far away. I'm just
But
We are here to emulate.
But Father Robert, this reminds me. There's a theme that we're seeing develop here as we go through this series and talk to the different friars, which is to say that in virtually every conversation we've had, the certainty of the end game, the goal, is distinguished from the route it takes to get there.
That's right.
Everybody goes through zigzags. Everybody runs into obstacles, whether they be rocks or mountains or trees. But what keeps them going is just keeping focused on where what the end game is, or what the city is, as it were, the city of Jerusalem, perhaps. And you've talked about your father as being one, let's call it him, an obstacle at that point in time, whether he knew it or not. what else got in your way in your journey towards becoming a Franciscan?
The priest of our seminary. I
Wow.
was at the minor seminary in
Yes.
San Fernando, Pampanga. They were discouraging me.
Why is that?
Why join the Franciscans? I think they wanted me to remain a diocesan seminarian and eventually become a priest of the diocese, which is now an archdiocese. No? So, but if my father could not dissuade me, how
What
much
more,
more?
yes.
In that case, of course.
But Father, this is an interesting example of the importance of discernment, right? Because in the normal course, one would think, here you have a priest telling me not to become a Franciscan, and so I would imagine that sent confusing signals to you as a
Yes,
teenager, right?
yes, yeah.
I'm already wanting to become a Franciscan, and you don't want me to become a Franciscan, and so
No, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, in his Principles of Discernment, also mentions listen to all the voices. No? This is actually not only Ignacio. Listen to all the voices, confirmatory voices, and also contrary voices.
yes.
But eventually, you have to bring all of this into prayer and discernment.
Yes.
It's just like a glass of water with so many things there. When you allow the water to settle down, the elements, and then things become clear.
Yes.
So in all this cacophony of voices, this is God's voice.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is God's voice. But that is only possible in the context of prayer.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the context of discerning what is happening to you in your heart and the events of your life, including those voices, whether supportive or contrary voices. So these are also valuable, and also they purify you. They purify your motive. Is this really coming from God?
Yes.
Because if it is just coming from me, if it meets opposition, then perhaps it will go away.
Yes.
But if it is really coming from God. So these are very important also, these
Right.
contrary
Right.
voices.
Right.
And so, and Father, you talk about prayer and discernment. Help us and the viewers understand a little bit about what is the process that we go through in prayer, and how do we encourage ourselves
Mhm.
to be clearer
Mhm.
and rather than just confused by all the prayers that we can pray.
Yes. I think very important is the starting point, how you understand prayer, how you understand relationship with God. If you see God as outside of you, is out there. So the way you see prayer is I'm trying to reach out to God. I'm trying to reach out to God. And sometimes that can be called spiritual appetite. No? God is separate. But when you see that God is with us in the depths of our being, in everything, and so prayer is just actually a consciousness of what is already there, of what you already have. We are already in relationship with God. And this is very clear in the life and writings of Saint Francis. And that's why when he describes prayer, he talks about prayer and devotion. And he says, he tells the friars that above all things is always to have the Spirit of the Lord. To pray always, and also to have a pure heart. So, meaning to say, God's Spirit is already there. Within me, around us, is already there. But to have that, to be aware of that, and to be conscious, and to respond accordingly. So if you have that kind of understanding, then prayer is not limited to the church. It is not limited to the prayer room. It is not limited to prayer times. But these are very important, these prayer times, because they help us to be more sensitive of God's presence even outside prayer time. You know? But to be in touch with a God who permeates all reality. And that's why we can really be praying without saying prayers.
Yes.
In that sense. And that's why we talk about the breath of the Spirit. And Saint Francis was very much in touch. So he said, above all things, have the Spirit of God. That's why a person then can always pray. Saint Francis said, pray always. And have a pure heart. The problem is sometimes our hearts are so many things, they have so many things. And that's why one of the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure of heart, they will see God. God is already there, but we don't see God's presence because there are so many things that are stopping us.
So many distractions. So much noise.
Lack of awareness,
Lack of
God's presence, because there are other things that are more upon us in terms of preoccupations, etc.
Would you say that that's a distinguishing feature of Franciscan prayer, Father Robert? This whole idea of God praying always and God being around us and with us already. I love the term. I've never heard of the term spiritual appetite you talked about, right? And you're making a distinction between praying to another somebody, an entity or being that is not there, versus praying already being aware of the presence of God. Is that a very Franciscan thing? Is that unique?
Of course, I'm using a modern terminology.
Yes.
We got that from the experience of the people in South Africa.
Of course,
The
yes.
segregation and the
Yes.
separation of the whites and,
Yeah.
the colored people. So apartheid, the whites are separate from
Yes.
the blacks.
Yes.
God is separate from me. That's why I call it spiritual apartheid.
Yeah, that's what, so it's such a powerful image for me. Yeah.
And Saint Francis, in his life and writings, he was using about the term the spirit of prayer and devotion. And so when you have that spirit of God within you, and it's already there, you just have to be aware of it and be in touch with that. And then whatever you do, you are actually connected to God. There is no time that God is separate from us, or else we will go into oblivion.
Yes, that's right.
And even if you use a modern terminology, St. Francis did not use this word, no? the word mysticism. That's the meaning of mysticism. It's the experiential awareness of God's presence. God is always present, and this is available for everyone. This is not only for the saints. For the saints, all of us are called to this experience. This experience of awareness of God's abiding presence and love. And that's why we have people who are ordinary mystics. So when you are always aware of God's presence, using the term mysticism, you are actually a mystic. So we should not even be afraid of this word.
Yes.
Of course, St. Francis did not use that. The terminology that he was using is prayer and devotion.
Now you use the two terms regularly, Father Robert, prayer and devotion. Is there a distinction between the two?
There's a light, but prayer especially is meaning to say we are in relationship with God. And we are already existentially in relationship with God. The challenge is, how does this existential relationship with God become personal? Become real? And within that context, devotion has something to do with the self-gift to this someone who gives himself to you, who has given himself to you even before you give yourself to him consciously. In the history of spirituality, there was even a time when devotion was used as a word for spirituality, for the spiritual life, for the relationship with God. But nowadays, I think the meaning has become very limited. We talk about some devotional practices.
Yes.
But basically, it means devotion in the history of spirituality is this intimate relationship with God, seeking God and openness to God. And in the writings of St. Francis, it was understood this way. And that's why when you have that spirit of prayer and devotion, you may be in a formal time of prayer and you are aware God is there, and then you give yourself completely. You are working in the kitchen as a mother. How do you practice a spirit of prayer and devotion there? God is there in the kitchen, right? We find this in St. Lawrence. He was assigned in the kitchen.
Yeah.
But he found God in the kitchen. So how do you find God in the kitchen? When you have the spirit of prayer and devotion, you will experience God. Then you will be giving yourself completely also to this dialogue with God, whether in prayer, in your work, in taking care of your children. So that is one of the lessons, I think, of prayer according to St. Francis. That's why he said, do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion, he told this to Saint Anthony of Padua. He allowed him to teach theology to the brothers, the first teacher of theology to the brothers. But he made a very important qualification. In your teaching of theology to the brothers, do not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion. Because sometimes I can be very busy, not only in studies, but many other things. But I am not doing this in the Spirit of God, in that awareness of God's presence.
So what I'm hearing you say, Father, is really finding God in the ordinary things.
Yes, yes.
In everyday life,
Mhm.
in daily life.
Mhm.
Do you have some suggestions on how we ordinary lay people can really heighten our awareness of God's presence in our lives? You know,
Yes,
finding the extraordinary in the ordinary.
The grace of God is already there. We have to take it that God is the one who is taking the first initiative in dialogue with us. He's the one reaching out to us all the time. So everything that we do is actually just a response. That's very clear to Saint Francis in the way he lives. Everything is a gift. Everything is given, including God's love and presence. And so how do I respond to that? Important thing is awareness. To be aware of the presence of God and His manifold actions, and then how can I respond? Now, we are not discounting here the importance of formal times of prayer, because they help us to be more sensitive also to God's presence outside formal time of prayer. For example, in a family, if you do not spend time with one another, like quality time, just spending time with one another, perhaps outside these formal times, you will not be conscious of your relationship with your family members. They say, I can pray all the time, but if I don't pray at a particular time, I cannot really pray all the time. I can pray anywhere. Sometimes you say that. But if you do not pray somewhere, how can you pray anywhere? So this is fundamental. We find that in Saint Francis. We find that in the life of Jesus and the apostles. They were taking times of prayer. That's why we have to take our prayer time seriously. Prayer time seriously. So we find this alternating in the life of Francis, these formal times of prayer and then ministry. Sometimes he would spend long time of prayer because that is what happens. We become more sensitized to the presence of God. Now even outside of prayer.
It sounds like, Father Robert, like many great truths, the answer is not in the either or, as you point out. It's not just formal prayer. It's both formal prayer and the awareness that you should be praying at all times to supplement one or the other. And that's both very logical, but also, in a sense, very hard to do and to remember. The whole idea of praying all the time, it seems so contrary to daily life, right? Where, especially in traditions where formal prayer is such an important part of our lives, the minute we leave church or we leave Mass, it's hard to keep thinking about continuing to pray when the priest sends us off in the final benediction. It's almost like you go back to normal life, in quotes, right?
That's the spiritual appetite.
Yeah, exactly. Back to your point about that's why that concept is so
you
powerful.
bracket things. This is prayer time, etc. No? Formal prayer times, and that's why the awareness is very important then. But this is something that we learn from Jesus through time, because ultimately Jesus is our teacher, even about prayer. I'm sure we know this even from ordinary experience. If we have this quality time with family members, for example, whom we love, and that's why experiences are very important here.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Even outside this time with your family, even if they are away, there is that awareness. They are in you. You are carrying them in your heart.
Yeah.
You are carrying them in your mind.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not always like I am thinking. There's a difference between consciousness and thinking.
Yes.
It's a difference. The consciousness is
The awareness.
It's not probing and pondering. That's contemplation, actually. Consciousness.
And it's interesting, Father, because and I'm sure our viewers are interested in hearing this, because we compartmentalize. That is the spiritual appetite. I think is really just the ability, our great ability as human beings, the human condition, to compartmentalize and say, okay, today is this, from 10 o'clock to 10:30, this is it, and then from 10:30 to 11 o'clock, it's this. And yet what you're saying is really very counterintuitive to that.
Yes, yes.
It's not compartmentalizing, it's just being aware and being mindful that God is present in everything.
Yes.
Everything, everywhere,
Yes.
and everyone.
Yeah.
Even the person that maybe we don't really want to talk to.
Yes.
And can you give us a few pointers maybe, as the viewers would be interested in some pointers on how we can quiet down our busy minds and perhaps separate ourselves from the too many distractions of our very technologically savvy world.
Yes, yes. One of the subjects I teach is spirituality and practice. And practices or disciplines are very important. I'm talking about spiritual disciplines. So people can have different ways of praying, but you have to have a form of prayer, and you have to have a form of discipline in prayer. So when you go deeper into that practice and experience, like contemplative practice, which can take different forms, so what happens, you become more aware of God's presence, first of all, within you. That's very true, for example, in centering prayer. So, because the more we become aware of God's presence within us, the more we become aware of God's presence outside of us. You see outside what you see inside. You experience outside what you experience inside. If your heart is filled with love, the way you see the world is different. So if you really experience this presence and loving presence of God within you, you cannot but just reject it without even making efforts. Of course, you have to grow into that. And that's why this is very clear also in St. Francis. He talks about maternal image, giving birth to Christ into the world. But you cannot give birth to Christ into the world unless He is within you and He grows within you. And He grows within you. So what happened to St. Francis, he was able to see God in everything, in his brothers, in creation, and even those experiences that are difficult. If you experience it, there is no more distinction actually. You don't categorize anymore.
Right.
Like good experiences and bad experiences. Because God is present in both. But you just have to be aware and see. And see.
Father, this is such a fascinating topic because, as well known as St. Francis is, there are a number of characteristics about St. Francis that are higher up in the imagination, in the contemporary imagination, right? Poverty clearly is high up there. Stigmata might be up there. So, well, of course, his relationship with nature and creatures is also high up there. But Franciscan prayer is fascinating to me, and yet it is less, perhaps, publicized, if you wish. Was there a similar, maybe try to draw an analogy here? We understand from earlier conversations that his radical simplicity and poverty was so appealing, in part because of the context of the time, with the feudal system and with the serf system. Was that a similar situation on the prayer front? In other words, what was the prayer discussion like in the church at the time? And was St. Francis's approach to prayer also a radical departure from that? Or tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we have to understand the historical development even of religious life.
Yes.
Before St. Francis and even St. Dominic, the form of religious life was monastic. Okay? So if you want to find God and grow deeper in your relationship with God, enter the monastery. Enter the monastery if you want to be holy and grow in holiness. So it's just like flight from the world. Now, with Saint Francis and Saint Dominic, they started this monastic apostolic life, and that's why Saint Francis said, "The world is his cloister." So you do not only experience God, and you do not only grow in your relationship with God in holiness in the monastery, which was the main way then at the time. So that was a radical departure. So it was just like democratizing already holiness.
Yeah.
Now everyone could become holy, really, and that was actually what we see in Jesus Christ. That's why he went back to the apostolic times. So what will happen to the people outside? So they started to minister to the people outside the monastery. And holiness was now possible, not only in the monastery. And so this experience of St. Francis, that the whole world is the monastery, it's a meeting point. Meeting point with God. It's creation. We find that in his mystical swan song in Canticle of Creatures.
Yes.
You see there?
Yes.
How God experienced, how St. Francis experienced God in all not only in creation, creatures, but in all reality.
Yes.
Imagine calling death sister death.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I love that image, Father Robert, of the democratization of prayer. In a strange way, I see a parallel. Maybe this is a really extended parallel. He did 200 years earlier what Luther was credited as doing with Scripture.
Yeah.
He is credited, rightly or wrongly, and there's a debate, of course, and a lively debate to this day about democratizing Scripture.
Yes.
Because at the time in the 15th century, 16th century, but Francis, in the 1200s, already democratized prayer. To your point, this is such a fascinating view of Franciscan prayer.
And that's why St. Francis says the life of the friar's mind is a life of living the gospel, following Jesus in the gospel. So he went back really to the gospel and encountering God in Jesus Christ through the gospels. Through the gospels, by really immersing yourself into the gospel. But it's not just meditating and reflecting on the gospels, but living, because he emphasized that real living.
I remember one of St. Francis's famous sayings or quotations is preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words.
And that's why if you apply that, especially for lay people, we are all called to be preachers in that sense, not only the priest. Perhaps we use more words because we have been ordained also to do that.
Yes.
But everyone is called to preach the gospel, to live the gospel. When you live the gospel, you are preaching already.
Yes.
And St. Francis emphasized also the primacy of witnessing.
Yes.
Primacy of witnessing.
Primacy of witnessing. Help us understand a little bit what that means, Father.
There was an incident in the life of St. Francis. He asked one of his brothers, "Come, let's go preaching." So they went around, they went to places, etc. And then after some time he said, "Let's go home, let's go back." And his brother said, "I thought we were going to preach." And Francis said, "We already preached." By their way of life and by their disposition and the way you behave in the world, you are actually already preaching. Of course, the Dominicans explicitly is also very clear to them as order of preachers.
Yes.
But of course, St. Francis preached also using words.
Yes.
But first of all, we preach by the way we live.
By the way you live. Right.
Because we can actually put what they call this, if our life, our behaviors do not conform to what we say,
Correct.
then we are counter preaching.
Correct.
And we are not being authentic.
Not being authentic.
I like that word as well, Father Robert. The idea of living the gospel, for me, is a more subtle and diffused way of looking at life than the much maligned works discussion, right? So people get all, pardon the pun, worked up over the word works. But living the gospel seems to be a much gentler and more realistic way of following Jesus Christ, and in Francis also in this case, because it's not doing, it's being. right? I think that maybe
And
there's
the doing must issue from being.
correct,
right?
correct. Not just
Receiving.
absolutely, absolutely.
St. Francis has been called the gospel man. And what's the gospel? It's Jesus Christ. And that's why ignorance of the scriptures, especially the gospel, is ignorance of Jesus Christ. So Celano would also say Jesus Christ in his mind, in his heart, in his hands, in everything. So the way he read the scriptures, it was not just an intellectual thing. It's really entering into the gospel and really encountering the person of Christ there. So eventually, the point is conformity to Christ, as we see him in the gospel. And that's why even in terms of prayer, Celano describes St. Francis, he did not so much pray, but he became prayer. He became
I love that image.
He became prayer himself. So St. Francis' prayer was not just having these prayer times, prayer activities, etc. His whole life, his whole person became prayer in deep relationship with God and breathing the Spirit of God. And so we see that also in terms of the gospel. He was breathing in the gospel, and so he could breathe out the gospel.
So every breath.
Every breath. That's why Celano said, in his hands, in his mind, in his heart, he was a gospel man. In one of the writings, one of his brothers, he had this vision of St. Francis and Jesus Christ. He could no longer distinguish. He could no longer distinguish who was St. Francis, who was Jesus Christ, because of this perfect conformity of St. Francis to the person of Jesus Christ.
He not only became an imitation of Christ, but he became just as
Because
Christ.
that's our calling, to be another Christ.
Right.
In our own way, in our own life, something like that.
So it was prophetic. The stigmata incident completes what you just described.
Yes.
It's like a punctuation mark
Yeah.
on what you just said, right?
Because all his life he was responding to the call of being conformed to Christ, in words, in deeds, in the way he lived his life. And so 2 years before he died, he received the stigmata on Mount Alberta, as you have mentioned, like
a punctuation mark.
Punctuation
In more ways than one.
It's really even visibly is conformity to Christ, because all his life he was trying to follow the poor and crucified Christ. This is a terminology in Franciscan spirituality. How do you understand Christ? In the time of St. Francis, the main image of Christ was the image of Pantocrator, the powerful Christ. Like, for example, the cathedral, this picture of a powerful Christ. If that is the Christ you have, the way you will live your Christian life is according to that image. Power is important thing. But the encounter of St. Francis with Christ is the poor and crucified Christ. So the Damiano cross, that is the image.
Yes. Was that the first portrayal in San Damiano? Because it's an altogether different depiction of Christ, wasn't it?
Yeah, because he encountered Christ more not in the cathedral, but outside the city, in a poor and dilapidated chapel, when he was praying, and this we know very well the encounter with St. Francis, and also within the context of his association already with the lepers.
Yes.
So how do you encounter Christ? Where do you encounter Christ? That's also very important. That's why the way he lived his life also. And the way he prayed, no?
Yes.
So all of this actually go together.
Right.
Yeah.
This idea, Father Robert, of becoming prayer is such a powerful image. And for me, it takes prayer even beyond what we thought of, because I myself have thought of it as being a separate activity almost. But it seems hard. I mean, for Len and myself, I can't speak for Len, but for myself it sounds hard.
Even for us, for us it's friars.
Right? And how do you deal with that? I mean, it seems intimidating almost for those of us who have prayed all our lives, but after listening to this conversation, it almost feels like we've been it's like baby prayer in a sense, right? As you mature, it almost commands us to raise our game, as it were. And I know we can't do this by ourselves, but back to Len's point about practical advice, right? Well, how can we exercise our spiritual muscles to start to get to that point, to become prayer? Seems like a big task.
Yeah, we have to humbly admit that we are on a journey in different aspects of life, including our relationship with God and also prayer. Even in spirituality, there are categories that we see describing that this life with God, this journey as Christian is a journey. There are stages, there are processes. So the call is a deepening experience, for example, of God, and deepening experience of prayer as pervading the presence of God of everything. So we have to grow into that experience. It is not like all of a sudden, of course, ultimately it's a gift from God. We just cooperate. So, as I mentioned a while ago, we need still these special moments of prayer. So I would ask, I would encourage everyone to have this real time for prayer. It is very important. Because in this time of prayer, it's just like really focusing ourselves to what is already there. Because even your experiences outside this prayer time, you bring them into prayer. And then you go out of this prayer experience so that you are more sensitized also to that experience. So one advice is this: when we take more seriously even our prayer times, and there is a deepening experience and a growing experience, and hopefully a more contemplative type of prayer. It's not just mechanical, because sometimes we can be praying mechanically, but it should really be a growing and deeper experience in a more contemplative way. Because if you look at also the different methods of prayer stages there is a deepening level of prayer experience. And so there are already contemplative practices that are there. Like if for you centering prayer, please grow in that practice. And when you grow in that practice, you will experience what St. Francis is also what he experienced. So whatever is that, in our Christian tradition, there are some practices. This is very clear also with Richard Rohr. No?
Yes.
He talks about contemplative practice, like even just 20 minutes.
Yes.
Because how do you pray?
Yes.
Of course, we need to meditate, we need different types of prayer, but hopefully, even in our prayer, we become more contemplative.
Because, Father, in Matthew 5, Christ speaks of coming into our inner room.
Yes.
And in the Psalms, we say, be still and know that I am God.
And outside this prayer times, the practice of awareness is very important. But if you sometimes it really takes also a lot of cooperation with God's grace.
Of course, yeah. Without which none of this really matters.
But eventually, by the grace of God, you grow in that contemplative prayer and awareness of God's pervading presence. Spiritual writers will talk about this in the beginning, like children, when they are learning how to write. Of course, you just write straight lines, etc. Yep. And then by practice, then you becomes a habit, becomes a way of life.
Is it fair to say, Father Robert, that you talked about two very important concepts, contemplation and awareness. Can I say that seeking that, or seeking to deepen your ability to encounter, to be aware and to reach levels of contemplation, is that a separate discussion from the way we pray? Because, of course, some people are more comfortable with rote prayer. There are others who are more comfortable with certain devotions. There are others who are comfortable with just meditative prayer. Is that like a different discussion altogether?
No, this devotional prayers that we have in the church are extremely very important. But the question also is, how do you pray this?
Right.
Like the
It's not,
rosary,
yeah, exactly.
you can pray it mechanically.
Yeah, it's not what, it's how.
Your
Yeah.
mind and your heart is not there.
Right.
But you can pray it also not only meditatively, but contemplatively.
Mhm.
So like, for example, that atmosphere is very important. And so that's why, if I may bring in St. Ignatius of Loyola,
Yeah.
he mentions about prayer in terms of before, during, and after.
Mm.
So before your prayer time, for example, is that you are already disposing yourselves. Huh?
The intentionality.
Yeah, intentionality, and you're creating the atmosphere. So in that sense, like you're praying the rosary, you already prepare your heart. And then how you pray it, slowly and contemplatively. Then what happens? It's not just finishing these many Our Fathers, but the rosary brings you to the presence of God,
Correct.
to the Blessed Mother. What happens now if that's the experience? It becomes a contemplative prayer.
Yes.
And perhaps you may not even finish all the mysteries.
Yes.
So
Yes.
for example, you are praying this way, and just 2 decades, you feel you are already in God's presence, and there perhaps even indications your heart is burning. Then stop this recitation.
Yes. That's right.
Be there with God who is already touching your heart.
Right. Right.
So it's not just like completing all this, of course, and then you may just continue after that, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a dance, no?
Yeah. It's a dance.
Prayer is a dance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it really brings back to what you were saying earlier, Father Robert, that it really is a relationship with God.
Relationship, yeah,
And as a result, it's also a relationship with ourselves.
with ourselves.
Because God lives in us. And it's recognizing the Christ in ourselves and in one another.
Yes, yes,
That- For me, that's what I'm hearing you saying, what prayer is about.
yes,
It's
yes.
really recognizing the Christ in myself and the Christ in everyone.
Christ in everything.
All
everything,
creation, everything
in
belongs.
everything.
Everything.
So the woodwork becomes your monastery. So if you are seeking God, you can, like for example, many of our parishioners, how many of the priests are in our parish, just us. But holiness is for everyone. A deepening life of prayer is for everyone.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think there is a lot to learn from Saint Francis and the other saints of the church.
That's,
It's not only yesterday we celebrate the feast of Saint Clare, no?
Yes.
Of course, there are lessons from them, but to be holy, not everyone is called to become a poor Clare.
Yeah.
But how do you become contemplative,
Yes.
prayerful in your context?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
and really listening.
Yes.
Listening and being mindful. of
And
the
sometimes
presence of God.
other people do not even recognize this. You can have someone, for example, in an office, you're working, but you are so in touch with God. You are so aware of God's presence within you and even outside. People do not even recognize actually you are praying. You are praying. So you have reached that kind of level of prayer by the grace of God. That's why we have contemplatives and mystics in different places.
Yes.
And we need
Yes.
this, huh?
This world so needs
And
that.
it's interesting, Father Robert, because at the age of 13, you felt that burning,
Yes,
that
yes.
mystical experience without really realizing
Uh-huh.
that it was a mystical
Yes,
experience.
yes. I just felt my heart. Maybe it was an experience of being in love, no?
Yes.
Yeah. Probably similar.
Passionately.
And well, just on that point, fathers, we're drawing to a close. How would you contrast your prayer life when you were maybe not 13? Let's say when you were 23. Let's call it. Well, versus your not versus, but compared to your prayer life today. I mean, in a couple of minutes, just tell us how about that journey. How has your prayer life evolved, changed? I mean, I think there's a message here as well in terms of our prayer life not being static. It's just like any relationship, it matures, it takes on a different character.
And there is no straight line. Also.
And there's no straight line either. It's
Experience
zigzag.
of
Yeah.
ups and downs, and that's why even when we talk about stages
Correct.
in spiritual life or
Correct.
prayer, it's not like a linear.
Yes.
course.
Yeah.
I mean, we experience. I mean, even in my life,
Yes.
there was a time when I went out of the seminary, you know.
Wow.
And for 1 year, I was not attending mass. I was
My
not
goodness.
praying.
Really?
I distanced myself from the church.
Yeah.
But when I look back, that was part of it. Everything is part of your life journey,
Of
something
course.
like that.
Of
So,
course.
so the same thing with prayer. The same thing with prayer. There have been times when I have neglected also my prayer. And when I had extinguished the warning of Saint Francis,
Yes.
extinguished the spirit of prayer and devotion because of work
Yes.
and many other preoccupations, perhaps.
Yes.
And then you just have to go back again. To go back to what you already had.
Yes. But you pray differently now? Do you pray differently now than maybe even 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
I hope.
That is our prayer,
Yeah.
that we can pray differently.
Yes.
As we grow, like you were saying, Father Robert, as we grow in prayer and as we grow in our relationship with Christ.
Yes. But it can also just be like if all your life you have been praying the rosary. And that's good. But the question is, you are now at this point in your life, how have you been praying the rosary?
Yes.
If perhaps in the past you were praying it as an obligation because your grandmother was asking you to
Correct.
pray it, and more mechanically, hopefully the way you have been praying the rosary has become more contemplative.
That's a great example,
Yeah,
Father.
I'm not saying you throw away the rosary. These are very important.
Yes.
I pray the rosary also.
Intention.
But how you have grown in praying the rosary is also good.
Yes. Yeah.
God is always leading us to a deeper relationship with Him. God is running after us.
Yes.
Running after
The
us.
hound
So
of
even if
heaven,
we run
yeah.
away from Him, He will run after us. I've experienced that in my life. And so the same thing with deepening level of prayer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because we love God, but God loved us first.
Even more.
Yeah. Even more. Yeah. Yeah.
And on that note,
Yeah.
Dennis, thank you.
What a terrific way to end.
Yes, that's,
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Father Robert, it was a real blessing.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm sure our viewers will agree. This was such a special moment for us to be discussing prayer and devotion. Thank you very much.
And I'm sure our viewers are interested to know a little bit more about Father Robert. So we will delve more.
Okay,
Yes.
okay, we can
What
do
Father
that.
Robert can share.
That's right. Future episode him.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you,
and
Father.
then
Thank you, Father
all
Robert.
that you do for God and the parish and other people.
Thank you, Father Robert. Thank you.
Thank you, Len and Dennis. Thank you, Father Robert, for giving us a new perspective of prayer and devotion. Be aware and listen. At a young age of 13, Father Robert listened to his heart. He knew that God was calling him, and nothing and no one could stop his burning desire to become a priest, not even his father. Like Saint Francis, he was ready to be disowned because it was clear to him that God was first. Even the choice to be a Franciscan came from God. The external signs and confirmations he was receiving from God would have been meaningless if he was not aware, if he did not listen, and if he did not respond. It is in seeking God that through constant communication with Him in prayer that we grow in awareness of God, revealing Himself to us, and eventually making prayer our way of life. We begin to see God in everything, in everywhere, and in everyone, as Saint Francis did, and ultimately, we become prayer ourselves. At this point, we would like to turn to you, our viewers. What have you taken away from this session? How does my relationship with God influence my prayer life? Please take a few moments to write down the question and reflect on the answer. Next week, we'll start our session with a sharer and also get to know our next friar. Thank you for joining us in today's Friarside Chats. See you in next week's episode entitled His Life, His Story, where we will learn about the interesting history of Franciscans in the Philippines.
Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me so love. Where there is injury, let me so pardon. Where there is doubt, let there be faith. Where there's despair, let me sow hope. Where there is darkness, let there be light. Where there is sadness, joy. Oh, divine Master, grant that I may never seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that